Among the horror film industry, and especially the genre of paranormal horror, there is always a series that comes to mind. That of the Conjuring series, following the strange, macabre, and eerie stories of Ed and Lorraine Warren. The first Conjuring movie proved to be very well accepted, even having the support of Lorraine Warren herself, along with the remaining family members of the Perron family, which the movie is mainly about. When The Conjuring comes to mind, what do you think of? Paranormal entities haunting a family of 7? The curse of an old witch lingering inside a house for innocent victims? The film was great and still remains to be one of my favorite movies of all time, and definitely my favorite horror movie ever. But how much of it was true, and how much of the real story was left out? For this episode, I dig into my absolute favorite supernatural tale of Ed and Lorraine Warren, and just in general, and the story of the Perron family and their residual haunting in Rhode Island. This is Grim Captivation, the paranormal podcast that delves into the mysterious, dark, and macabre tales of the supernatural. For this episode, I used the main source of House of Darkness, House of Light, the book trilogy, written by the very own Andrea Perron, one of the daughters who was part of this residual haunting, full of good and bad spirits alike. And I'll also be, throughout this episode, I'll be pretty much quoting from the book itself, so if it seems like it's very, run-on, not really shifting between quotes and stuff, it's because I am using the quotes from the book itself, so not as to confuse anybody. So, the telling of this true story is not intended to persuade the reader of its authenticity. Those who believe in the existence of the spirit world will not require convincing. Those who do not believe so will likely remain skeptical. It matters that this tale be told with honesty and integrity. Embarking upon the journey has been scary in its own right. For the past 40 years, the family involved has remained guarded and exclusive about their mutual experience. Delving into the painful memories has proved difficult. Rekindling imagery, disturbing emotions long repressed. Exhuming the dead spawned its share of its nightmares. And yet it is a tale worthy of telling because it is true. A collective memoir worthy of sharing because of the message a family received. It is a tale of good and evil, life and death, darkness and light. Evil exists. Despite the negative views of traumatic experiences, one must also consider that the fight between darkness and light exists for us as humans to choose which side we take. Coming from the words of Ed Warren and the words that appear at the end of The Conjuring, actually, he says, "Diabolical forces are formidable. These forces are eternal and they exist today. The fairy tale is true. The devil exists. God exists. And for us as people, our very destiny hinges upon which one we elect to follow. If we choose to follow the path of darkness, the spirits of the dark will follow us and guide us into further temptation and darkness. If we choose to follow the path of the light, it will cause us to have a difficult journey throughout our lives, straying away from temptation, but ever present to try and sway us back into sin. Many horror films portray this, especially those of paranormal movies. For me, when I focus on the Conjuring films, I see the fight between the light and the dark, where the light ultimately saves lives and wins in the end, despite the many days and weeks that the Perron family had gone through. But what you believe when it comes to the supernatural is always up to you and your personal faith. So let's get into the story of The Conjuring, with the Perron family and the supposed demonic spirit of Bathsheba. So, starting from the origins of the house and its, supposed witch's curse, there are more rumors than facts, or so it seems. Bathsheba was indeed an actual person, who lived on the Sherman lands when she married Judson Sherman in 1844, based in Harrisville, Rhode Island. One of the rumors surrounding Bathsheba was that when there's an infant child's skull was found impaled and where Bathsheba was the last person to be seen in the child's care. This supposed situation was never searched further and therefore remains a long-lost rumor. Another story around Bathsheba is one that is highlighted in the Conjuring movie, where they talk about her sacrificing her and Judson's son as her love and dedication to Satan. It is said that she climbed a tree, proclaimed her love to Satan, and hanged herself in 1849, cursing the land and the house that anyone who lived there would be haunted and watched by her. Now, there are records here and there about Bathsheba, but nothing is concrete about it. There was, however, a Judson Sherman who died in 1881, following with a tombstone in Harrisville that has Bathsheba Sherman's name, dated that she died in 1885. With that being said, her alleged hanging in 1849 seems to be fabricated, or it's up to you guys. However, in Andrea Perron's book of House of Darkness and House of Light, she believes that rather than Bathsheba haunting them, it was actually a matriarch of the Arnold Estate who hanged herself inside the barn in 1797. This spirit, Abigail Arnold, was actually a good spirit who consistently warned the Perron children of incoming malevolent spirits. Additionally, Andrea writes about the origins of her childhood house, saying, "This woman is not alone. There are others, many others, who shared her fate. What some might describe as a fate worse than death. Perhaps she is the one who tucked the girls in at night, the one who loved them and tenderly kissed their foreheads and smelled of flowers and fruit. It was a presence of comfort and caring, one who never meant to frighten or disturb youngsters in their own beds. Instead, she was a light in the darkness of night, someone to watch over them. It was this holy presence which tempered their fear. In the framework of an inexplicable existence for a family dwelling in a house alive with death, it was a welcome presence, a protective influence in an otherwise scary place. She was not the only one. Johnny Arnold, presumably a relative, made the same critical decision to take his own life in the eaves of the house where he remains. As gentle a spirit as this elderly woman was, he too made his presence known. He was an omnipresent spirit. From the day they arrived at the farm, there to greet them in the dark shadows of a doorway, one cast as a figment from another dimension. Leaning back into his perpetual pose, watching, no doubt wondering, about a sudden changing of the guard, he too would soon become a familiar part of the new landscape. And then there was Bathsheba, a godforsaken soul. Whatever the beginnings of this house had, spirits were attracted to this place, and had unseen battles against each other. Considering that this book of Andrea Perron is called House of Darkness, House of Light, it implies that not only did malevolent spirits try to cause harm on the family, but that benevolent spirits were trying their best to comfort them in a time of terror and distress. Even before moving into the infamous Conjuring house, the Perron family had their own set of strange disasters even before moving in. Roger and Carolyn Perron purchased a different house, assume their first house, my bad on that part, in the suburbs of 1964. It was an adequate, modest Cape Cod-style house with a generous backyard. They had made the deliberate choice based on the quality of the schools their children would attend. Cumberland, Rhode Island held promise as a peaceful and quiet community in which to raise a family. During the summer of 1970, the changing society around them became encroaching, imposing itself upon their idyllic existence. As a result, a childhood innocence was lost, a sense of security was sadly forsaken, and everything was about to change. After the summer of moving in, and where the children of 5 daughters, which included Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, had done their chores well enough, their further weeks and months would change dramatically. Surprisingly, the girls were gifted a brand new puppy, a unique breed called an African Basenji. Carolyn told them they should give it a unique name as well, where they settled on the name of Bathsheba. Now, is this kind of a coincidence that they named their own puppy Bathsheba? The name is in itself biblical, a woman whose figure seduced King David of the Old Testament to give into temptation and ultimately bring her husband to certain death. The rumors of Bathsheba, the Satan worshipper in the late 1800s, was presumably a figure of temptation as well. I note this because the Perron family weren't particularly, I wouldn't say they weren't religious, but I guess they didn't pick up on the name itself, so kind of odd that they chose that. After the puppy was admitted into the family, it was soon snuffed out by a tragic car accident, in which the daughters were all there to witness. Although the dog didn't die immediately after being hit by the car, they heard the sounds of police officers' guns firing, signifying that the dog had no chance of surviving. Not only did the dog's death mark a dark beginning in the new Perron home and their town, but news of malicious pranks and assaults were reported soon after. A list of minor and major infractions included a number of petty thefts, then the gangland assault on their schoolyard playground, from vicious pranks to more threatening encounters with rumors of weapons involved. For the most part, bad boys were fighting amongst themselves, resulting in a series of black eyes and fat lips. When they began aggressively targeting several girls in the neighborhood, Carolyn disdainfully announced that they were toxic, testosterone poisoned. A vigilant mother forewarning her own away from all of them. On the day she was informed of an attempted sexual assault on a young girl who had been gagged, bound to playground equipment at their elementary school, they instantly lost their freedom. Once relegated to the backyard, the children began wondering what was going on around them in a place where they felt so safe. Not one considered that these terrible boys soon escaped the Perron family as they planned a simple vacation for a few days, and although it lifted the spirits of the family as a whole, they would return back to their home with more devastating news. When they pulled into the driveway, Roger immediately noticed that the door to the sun porch was wide open. His mother had been watching over their house, and he assumed that she came last, had forgotten to close or lock it. Then Carolyn saw something lying limp in the picnic table. By the time she could intervene, Andrea was already out of the car, running to greet her normally frisky kitty, Scrunch. Andrea called her by name. There was no response, no movement. The child could not believe her eyes. The gruesome discovery dropped her to her knees. Her precious cat had been brutally killed, murdered. Her skull was crushed, every bone in her body shattered. It is unnecessary to describe what ensued. Carolyn comforted her while Roger removed the stiffened carcass. He then entered the house to find that it had been thoroughly ransacked. Food from the kitchen cupboards poured all over the floor, their furniture overturned, mirrors shattered. A freezer full of food was open, provisions saturated with motor oil. All the cats were missing. With a frantic phone call, Roger learned that his mother had only been there for a few hours before their arrival and had indeed blocked the house. She left their Siamese cats inside and let the other two out to play, as the weather was fine and her son was expected home later in the day. As Roger searched their house, utter despair turned into wild rage. The freezer in the basement, fully stocked with meats, was destroyed beyond repair. Nothing could be salvaged. He peered inside at all the food intended to feed his family, trembling with justifiable anger. With the deaths of both the dog and the cat, Andrea became so angry, but not just that, a darker self who was vengeful against the attackers who were ultimately caught and punished for their deeds. Andrea would soon find this attacker who she beat so savagely and harsh that the only saving grace was an oncoming passerby who demanded for Andrea to stop and go home. It wasn't long until another death occurred on their land. In front of their house, Carolyn had made a garden with several stones scattered about, where one of their neighbors thought it resembled a tombstone, a rather grim remark, but would soon make it terribly true. From the source, the victim was only known as Mr. Curtis, who tragically had a heart attack as he was backing out of the property and unfortunately died in the process, but also where his limp body had pressed onto the gas pedal, crashing into the stones of the Perrons' lawn. A third death on the Perrons' family home. Mrs. Curtis would actually blame Carolyn for her husband's death, claiming her as a witch. With so much death and negativity involved, Carolyn urged Roger to have them move somewhere in the country, but Roger told her that there was no way able to financially move anywhere. However, when Roger was out of town for his job for a few days, Carolyn had told her closest friend Kathy that she had gone to a large place, a 9-bedroom house with a barn and 200-plus acres, and put down a payment to secure the house. She had originally found this house in a newspaper ad, listing the house for a mere $75,000. Despite Kathy's shock, Carolyn waited. Eventually, after Roger's original resentment of purchasing the house and the land, the family would visit the area, and soon after, the hesitant plunge was made. The new Perron house was settled. Little did Carolyn know, Roger was strangely attracted towards the house and its almost unearthly vibe. He found himself plagued by the aromas of the distinctly earthy scent. The cellar of the farmhouse. It was as if it had been trapped, embedded in his sinuses, an unusual scent strangely enticing to him. He divulged having been distracted by visions, recurring images of the farm, especially by the river. He had then revealed his deepest and most personal reaction. He'd never felt so attracted or attached to a place before, so anxious to return, like being drawn to a magnetic field of streams and dreams. Even between the two parents, both Carolyn and Roger were in love with the house, especially with the river that flowed close by and with the open land that they dreamed of. It was too good to be true. Even if it was, the children were ecstatic for a new house. Even if it meant less trips and gifts, the entire family were excited for the new move. While Roger was off the majority of the days on the road for his trucking job, Carolyn was able to pick up a few jobs here and there while her closest friend Kathy took care of the kids throughout the summer. This was all before moving into the house in Harrisville, where they eventually bought it from Mr. Kenyon, who seemed reluctant to sell it at first and who also seemed a little too friendly to Carolyn. Either way, they ultimately sealed the deal in 1971. After moving into the new house, Roger couldn't help but remembering a phrase that Mr. Kenyon, the seller, had said to him. "For the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night." In the first night, Roger had that phrase recalling in his mind, and he thought that the house was almost too dark inside. Once the family was settled in rather well, Mr. Kenyon returned again and asked if everything was all right, where Roger reported that there were a lot of cold spots, blaming it on the old furnace, but also added there were odd and unusual noises, especially during the nights. Within the house, there was a chimney closet that provided warmth among all the cold spots, and this is where April, the youngest daughter, spent her time playing with her toys. However, it would be found out later that April had a secret revolving around this spot. So the initial residual haunting of the Perron family could include the cold spots and the creaking of the house, but it could also include the first sound of odd footsteps that Carolyn heard while only she and April were home. During the day, Carolyn was busy in the kitchen, hearing the playful noises of footsteps upstairs, but when April came behind her seconds later, it startled her and confused her with the strange noises. When Carolyn found nothing in the room upstairs, April responded that she heard noises like that all the time. Carolyn prodded her again about it later in the day, but April shrugged it off. This, I believe, was kind of the start of the infestation stage of the demonic presences, or at least the paranormal entities that were not only making themselves at home, but playing with the youngest Perron daughter. Carolyn began to have dark thoughts about the house soon after, wondering if something truly was there with them. Odd sensory auras messed with her head, and she soon saw that an old clock that Roger had gotten was no longer working, stopping hours before she realized it. Not only were there strange auras and feelings of discomfort, the peculiar sensation that the paranormal entities were reaching out was felt by the daughters. Cynthia had described it as being in the bubble. To describe these children as isolated is only a small part of the story. They had no choice but to adjust them, then adapt to an ethereal environment, one totally contrary to what each discerned as reality. What they knew of the world had changed abruptly, compelling them to reconcile heavy concepts for one so young. It took time. As human beings have a tendency to tick-tock through life, they did the same. Whenever it happened, and a youngster felt her body trembling from inside out, time was suspended. It ceased to exist, if it ever did. During these moments, what Cynthia described as being in the bubble occurred. That certain icy tingle, a surge of energy or synergy charges in, and everything becomes one thing, frozen in time. No matter how frightening or ugly it is, what is there is amazing. That this happens is miraculous. Stepping through time, feeling its irrelevance, is awe-inspiring, a powerful emotional experience. Reading this made me think of how people freeze in the moment of terror or fright, but more than that, a lingering sense of fright that causes the daughters to truly process the idea of ethereal entities trapped in their house. That alone can not only startle the kids, but also make them terrified in a place that they should feel comfortable and non-invasive. Apparently there was a specific hallway in which everyone felt off and where they felt watched whenever they walked through it. Not only this, but it's this hallway where the cellar door was found, causing the residents of this haunted house to be averted from the door and where an earthy smell came from it. In this same hallway was where the first apparition appeared, but only to the two of the daughters, and surprisingly on the first day that they moved into the house. This phantom man stood in the corner behind the door. Creepy as it is, the two daughters didn't tell anyone at this first appearance. It wouldn't be too much later then one of the girls would have their first physical intervention with the spirits. This was a moment when Cynthia, or Cindy in some references, she was quickly gathering her school supplies one morning when an unexpected thing happened. As she stepped across the threshold of the kitchen door, Cindy was intercepted by a silky, smoky figure emerging through the cellar door. It placed itself directly in her path. There was no time to stop, no time or react. She inadvertently body-slammed the intruder. As she did so, it disappeared, vaporizing instantly. The apparition was indistinguishable, more a mass than an actual form. At point of impact, the intense odor and frigidity all but halted her momentum, knocking her back in her tracks. She breathed in deeply into her lungs with a gasp of frozen air. This sudden foul influx caused her body to lurch into spasm, coughing and convulsively, propelling the girl forward with violent jolts. A reflex reaction. It had literally stopped her cold. During that day in school, she would fall asleep in one class, and what the teacher had called on her, she was sent home, but also when she would be asleep for the next 2 days. Cynthia was the initial point of contact, the first one to feel the stunning sensation, the passing essence of death itself, stealing and stalking whatever it could as a method of manifestation, as an infiltration. It's interesting that she calls it an infiltration because, as I've mentioned before in the stages of demonic possession episode, one of these stages was the infestation stage, which I mentioned earlier, where a spirit can make themselves known and sometimes with their intention. So with this first interaction, the haunting of the parents' house had officially begun. Along with the infestation stage of demonic possession comes the oppression stage, where victims can be worn down either physically or mentally. Carolyn, the mother, had begun to ache in her muscles and joints more than usual, and where she felt extremely cold all the time. The only thing she could do was press on. However, it was colder and colder before she eventually turned her attention to the farmhouse shed, where they stacked their firewood, but also where their cat eventually decided to spend most of its time. Normally a friendly cat, it would never want to go into the house and would only spend nights with the children, but almost out of fright. It would hop onto the bed, look around the room, and hide under the covers. Sometimes the cat would literally swing at nothing with claws extended before darting from the room. Something was definitely there, an unseen servant of malicious intent. An odd thing would happen during the winter that didn't cause harm, but was simply out of the ordinary. Houseflies would gather in the farmhouse in the dead of winter, sometimes focusing on Carolyn. It was peculiar in that sense alone, but if houseflies show up in the winter of a farmhouse, something ominous lurks behind those signs. Day after day, the flies would show up and invade the house. It was as if there was no stop to them. For a time, both Carolyn and Roger guessed these flies were breeding from within the deep crevices and cracks of the walls. When the flies became too much of the nuisance, they called an exterminator, but when the day of the visit came, the flies had suddenly disappeared. The man had reported that there was nothing there when it came to flies. Were the malevolent spirits of this house watching their every move, listening to every word? Creepier than that, were these spirits able to send swarms of insects in a day's time and able to recall them just as quick? Either way, it's a nasty thing to think about. During the following week, everything changed. Inexplicably, the phantom flies disappeared. Years later, a woman would arrive and explain that the flies were there with purpose and reason, as the harbingers of things to come. She would look Carolyn in the eyes and speak from her heart. You can't really kill what's already dead. This woman who would see that ugly truth of their situation and share these quiet words of wisdom was someone familiar with what was essentially malevolent onslaught, painfully aware of its darkest point of origin, Mrs. Lorraine Warren. She'd come a long distance to observe their household and all of its occupants, to observe, like a fly on the wall. There was no doubt, after all the strange incidents with their pets and the insect infestation, that something was off. Though no one spoke of it aloud, all of them had the uncommon sense. They were not alone. Children are perceptive, sensitive, and vulnerable to the spirit world. As this was their initial point of contact, no one knew precisely what to make of it, but they knew something was around them all the time, and sometimes it was something wicked. Signs from the spirits were more obvious. When school resumed and Andrea took to her studies seriously, she would sometimes see the chalkboard with her notes all smudged or erased, causing her frustration. Her sisters would ultimately see this as well, but none of them reported this to their parents for whatever reason. Later on, Andrea saw that the chalkboard was completely destroyed by the spirits, shattered into thousands of pieces of wood and slate, an impossible feat for any of the daughters to do. Roger found the chalkboard initially, but didn't blame anyone in his family. The spirits were becoming malicious and violent. But what would happen next would up the level of malevolent intentions. One day, Carolyn ventured into the barn on a cold winter day, wondering what other animals they could keep in there. As she looked around, she saw that a dangling hand scythe was up at the top. She didn't remember it being there initially when Mr. Kenyon showed them the place. She took the thought away, and as she began walking away, the scythe had somehow loosened from its holding and was heading directly towards Carolyn. Carolyn recalls becoming instantly transfixed, mesmerized by the object as it approached. She was paralyzed, unable to retreat. Though her mind was as provoked as her body, speaking to the subject of self-preservation, trembling legs would not cooperate. Carolyn stood there, rigidly in place, watching the trajectory of the scythe. As it struck her slender form, its blade slicing hard against both her neck and shoulder, the violent force of a blow she expected was stunning nonetheless. There it lay, beside her boots, on frozen planks of wood, as still as the air, its momentum stifled, its threatening tone silenced by the strike. Carolyn stared at the wayward tool as she slowly reached up to touch the wound, fearful of what she might find in its wake. It was then she'd realized the multiple layers of clothing she'd been wearing as protection from cold morning air had been proved as a blessing in disguise. Strangely enough, Carolyn would soon learn that the woman that I mentioned earlier, Mrs. Arnold, had hanged herself from that barn, and from the very beam that the scythe had fallen from. This sense of impending doom didn't just scare Carolyn out of her wits, but made her realize that whatever was plaguing her house was far from good. The spirits were not done with attacking Carolyn either. Soon after, there was a random event in a room where all privacy should be respected. It was a day when Carolyn decided to clean the fireplace, and when she and April were done with their messy chore, Carolyn took a warm shower quickly after. But when she was done, she was suddenly and abruptly attacked by a coat hanger. As she began removing a robe to dress, a large coat hanger lifted from the rack beside her, then struck the woman repeatedly, on her head and neck. Carolyn began to scream, and alarm beckoned everyone in from the kitchen, including their house guest. Entering the bathroom en masse, they witnessed a vicious attack, nobody believing their eyes. Once that beating subsided, the coat hanger fell to the floor. Those gathering around stood in stunned silence. It was altogether a traumatizing event for everyone. It was a sign for everyone to know the spirits wanted them gone, or that they wanted the family to be hurt. When their house guest that day was leaving, she said to Carolyn that the Kenyons always left the lights on at night. It was clearly the same phrase that Mr. Kenyon had told them when they chose to purchase the place. During the first several months in the farmhouse, so many awful incidents occurred. It became difficult to keep track. Spooky sounds, a fly infestation, disturbed animals in conflict with invisible foes, demonic doors opening and closing at will, mind-numbing manifestations, finger-numbing cold. What was one to think? Noxious odors, the smell of death, coat hanger and scythe, an omen or two of animosity shared in kind. Carolyn was under attack. It would soon become evident she was the target of someone's disdain. Despite the horrible events, Carolyn was hesitant to discuss it with Roger. His doubts and the accusations, implicit and explicit, were leveraged as weaponry throughout a campaign founded on mutual distrust. Moving to the farm altered them as individuals. With so much paranoia and anxiety, both Carolyn and Roger would become more separate as a couple, with Roger not believing her and with Carolyn's mental health deteriorating. A few times Roger would even yell out that the house smelled like death. The children were scared of both their parents, and for various reasons by that point. Eventually it got to the point where a simple argument could provoke a spirit's presence. Most times when it happened out in the open, an object would fly across the room or something would move dramatically, diverting the attention away from the fight. Other times it was the stench of death that would quell the fight, causing both sides to back away and not bother to open their mouths. Whatever was there got in the middle of it. Perhaps it was one of the benevolent spirits that called Manny that intervened in these harsh fights. This spirit was seen by Nancy the day that they moved in, and he never caused any harm, only watched the family with a sort of warmth. Eventually, the whole family recognized Manny as part of their house family. In a way, and it was never really scary for them, seeing him as a protector of the house. Yet even so, the place had other spirits, more evil ones than good, or so it seemed, and that they preyed on Carolyn continuously. Despite her knowledge that the more evil spirits make their presence known at night, there were others that made their existence known in the day. Those who made their presence known during the day were mischievous, or simply oblivious to the morals that they spooked. Sometimes the manifestations were deliberate in nature, intent upon making a point, sweeping their kitchen floor, or changing the station on the stereo. Sometimes the visitations seemed entirely arbitrary, as if they were passing the time by passing through time. The farmhouse, their place in the country, was nothing less than a portal for the immortal. They didn't seem to have any concept of time in the same way humans measure existence. However, one of the spirits at night appeared as a little girl, crying and appearing as an opaque shadow in the corner of Cindy's bedroom, and disappearing once dawn had arrived fully. It would return again, back at dusk. Along with strange appearances and interruptions of the spirits, the continued stench of something dying lingered in the house. It was a nuisance for everyone. Eventually, whenever Roger was home, he began to notice some of the doors were left open, and after the night was spent and morning came. He didn't think of it at first, but still noted it. Their house was coming to life. Not only was the pantry door in the parlor refusing to remain latched, the demon door beside it, an alternate route to the cellar, began some shenanigans of its own. Opening at will, it filled the room with an earthy, acrid odor. The door no one ever opened, an order due to its unsafe stairwell, kept opening over and over again throughout the course of the evening. It unlatched, then drifted a few inches, stopping in the same spot, as if someone was peeking into the parlor. A cellar as creepy as any on earth was on the other side of it, down the dark corridor and a rickety set of stairs. The anomaly began after dinner once Carolyn built a fire. The door would continue to open on its own and also emit the terrible stench of death, which everyone was now accustomed to. They all hated the smell, but it was a regular sensation now. Carolyn didn't want these suspicions confirmed, wanted to be dead wrong. Andrea wanted to ease her mother's stress. Nancy thought it was kinda cool. Christy resorted to a planned ignore strategy, and Cynthia was too frightened to breathe, let alone speak of what she'd seen and heard. April did not want to disclose a newfound playmate. Deliberately withholding vital information kept their astounding discovery quiet. Each of them used specialized survival techniques and developed coping skills which kept the peace and kept special secrets safe. Roger seemed oblivious to what was happening to his family. Though he privately harbored suspicions of his own, they were of an entirely different nature. His fear was rooted in the real possibility his wife was facing some sort of breakdown, transformation. The mixing of the demonic possession stages of obsession and oppression were making themselves known. Carolyn constantly felt paranoid, always cold, and she would no longer sleep well at all. Whatever dark entity was haunting their house, it latched onto her and stayed with her. Along with the constant bickering between Carolyn and Roger, the distrust and disbelief of Roger grew immensely, claiming he did not believe in ghosts several times, so of course he did not believe in his wife. She tried telling him of another account that seemed wild to believe. Their dresser in the bedroom had somehow caught fire. Only the dresser, and when she stood staring at it for so long, she felt that she was suddenly dropped from a distance. She was levitating high in the air, watching the dresser be lit on fire, and then dropped. But the fire was suddenly gone in seconds, as if nothing had happened. Roger wouldn't believe her. Things like that didn't happen in reality. It was extremely odd. He didn't believe that, but when one day he heard April playing with her toys in the chimney closet, he listened as she explained how puzzles worked, chatting to herself. Little did he know, there might have been someone else there with her. With Carolyn's continuing sickness, the next apparition attack was much more personal and much more vicious. And at this point I haven't talked much about the film of The Conjuring much, but for the next malicious entity attack, it is the scene where Carolyn is presumably possessed by the evil entity. It's during this time that Carolyn is attacked from above while trying to get some rest. Opening her eyes, pale dawn light revealed the grotesque figure of a woman hovering above her. Carolyn was staring directly into the torso of an apparition which had usurped the bureau beside the bed, standing in its place. The sudden rush of terror pulsed through her body, jolting the woman awake, sending one horrified soul scrambling for cover beneath a cotton quilt. Exposing itself solicited scrutiny while breathing abject terror and loathing into its victim, forcing its putrid stench deeply into her breathless lungs. A description conjured was beyond mortal comprehension. The hideous creature approached silently, as if closing in to steal a kiss or claim a life. Carolyn heard herself shrieking as the spirit drew nearer, but still, not a sound would come. Nothing but a squeaky whimper would penetrate the frozen knot of vocal cords lodged within her throat. Digging her feet deeply into the covers beneath their quilt, Carolyn kicked Roger repeatedly, scraping his shins with her toenails. It drew closer. One black stick of an arm flopped down across her pillow as the entity leaned over, its head curiously cocked to one side, as if it was studying her. Terrified of being touched, Carolyn's first instinct was to hide, an inclination to cower beneath the quilt, though she had kicked her share of it too far beyond reach. Breaking backward, frantically scampering away, Carolyn catapulted up against the headboard of the bed, crashing it into wrought iron hardware of the doors directly behind it, loudly enough to wake the dead and living alike. Eyes sought a face. Well, there was no face, only a swirling, rancid mass of rotting flesh resembling a desiccated hornet's nest, covered in what appeared to be a mesh of blackened cobwebs, flimsy wisps of wiry hairs clinging to the ground. Grabbing a fistful of the disheveled hair, Carolyn jerked Roger's head severely back and forth in her desperate attempt to wake the motionless man. His body was limp, lifeless. His wife was sick inside, certain her husband was dead. Uncontrollable panic ensued, believing the intruder had killed him and was about to claim her, an intention to stop her heart, to literally scare her to death. An evil entity stalking its prey began moving in for the kill. As a spontaneous reaction, she slammed her body up against the headboard. Sliding aside, she landed on Roger, fighting for some distance, fighting for her life. The woman's silent screams were deafening, her mind manufacturing at a full volume what her body had refused to provide. The wretched being floated cloud-like above her, inches away, becoming a part of whatever it was in its way, on its way to its target. Aversion so intense, its repulsive odor overwhelming, it caused her stomach to heave reflexively. Carolyn fought for control, taking shallow, panting breaths, forcing out fine mist from her lips, obscuring the appalling view of what she presumed would be her bitter end. In those dreadful moments, it never occurred to her that she might survive this ordeal. The ghastly apparition aligned its hellish head with the face of its intended victim. In the last instant before contact, Carolyn whispered the only words she could form or utter in a moment of pure panic. "God, help me." Gasping for air, gasping an edge of the covers with gnarled fingers trembling, she braced for impact. Yanking the blanket toward her head caused it to shift, falling off to Roger, revealing his torso, the shocking sight momentarily diverting her rapt attention from the imposing apparition. She had ceased breathing, her mind shrieking in horror. His back and shoulders, even his rib cage was scored, deeply abraded with scratches, as if he'd been clawed to death by a wild animal. Seeking out the entity, she knew she was next. Just like that, the spirit was suddenly gone. As if by the true intention of provoking God's guidance, the evil entity was gone from the premise. But the horrible stench, that deathly aroma, lingered in Carolyn's throat. She reached over and realized Roger was not a lifeless body as he rolled over to the opposite side in a deep sleep. He was alive, and she was too. But something had invaded her just then, an invisible enemy that only caused harm and trauma. When Carolyn was viciously attacked, she immediately began to write down brief scribblings on the description of the spirit itself. Her own words goes as the following. The dress, rusty green jersey, handmade, hand-dyed fabric, belt, cinched at the waist with an oval bucket, covered in same fabric, vintage clothing, a being from another time, ugly, beehive, head, a hornet's nest, broken neck snapped, hanging to the side, no eyes, no mouth, gray, mesh cobwebs, no hands, no feet, just floating above me, cold, so cold, can't breathe, vile, evil, death, no bureau gone, coming closer, cold, can't breathe, so close, too close, wants to touch me, don't touch me, head draped at an angle, wants a kiss, dear Lord, oh my God. Other notes repeated some of the same descriptions, but she was sure to add other very sinister details. These notes included vile, evil, decomposing flesh, repulsive, stench, decay, putrid odor, need to vomit, want to scream, oppressive, diabolical, not of this world. What is this thing? Bureau gone, Roger dead, hovering over me, breathing into me, studying me, head cocked, neck broken, fighting to breathe, can see the mist. As she was finishing writing about her night of terror, she looked at the timepiece, a large clock that Roger had brought in previously, and saw that the time had mysteriously stopped at 5:15 a.m., despite the fact that it was 6 by then. It wasn't an ominous sign just then, but curious nonetheless. When she was up to get her coffee, Andrea came down and had read her notes. When Carolyn saw this, Andrea responded with something chilling. She said, "Mom, I know her. I dreamed this. It woke me up. She wants to hurt you." "What is this? Was it a bad dream? I had a nightmare too. You were there. She was too. Hanging over you. It woke me up, but then I couldn't move. You were screaming and I couldn't come to help. But I could hear you." At this, Carolyn is extremely worried for her family. She pressed Andrea on, asking about her experience. Andrea answered, "I see shadows in my bedroom, even when the moon is small, in the dark. Sometimes I hear voices before I go to sleep. I can't understand what they're saying to me. I don't like to be in the bathroom alone. It feels like I'm being watched, like I'm being looked at while, It's embarrassing. Stuff moves around at my desk while I'm doing my homework, and you know what happened to our chalkboard. Mom, you can tell me about the truth. Do we have ghosts?" Carolyn told her daughter to keep the awful attack secret and about its horrific appearance, but there was no doubt that there were ghosts in the house. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. One night, Cindy had joined Andrea to sleep one night. Cindy was scared beyond belief. She'd had enough of the spooky spirits. She wanted to let her mother know of one in particular, but to have Andrea tell her mother, saying, "Tell her about the lady who comes after she tucks us in, how she leans over to me to kiss me, but I never feel the kisses. It's not Mom. I know it's not. She smells different than Mom does. Mom smells like soap, but this lady smells like flowers and fruit. But then after she leaves, another lady comes late at night. It always says threes on the clock when she wakes me up. I feel her first. She makes me so cold, and then the room stinks. She's the one who hates Mom. I saw her in my bad dream when Mom was screaming and the ghost wouldn't let me go to help her. I saw it happen." That fateful night was indeed the turning point of the entire haunting. The daughters had nightmares revolving around the exact same attack against their mother. But was it a nightmare, or was it some kind of vision? Was this a strange alliance between malevolent spirits to pin down the daughters and paralyze them from helping their mother? Either way, the ghosts had the upper hand now. The haunting and the possession were dominating their family life already. Testimonials began within days of the manifestation in Carolyn's bedroom. One after another, the girls came to their eldest daughter, to their eldest sister, reluctant to share their many unusual experiences, feeling safe to do so with her. Their stories were disturbing, everything from vibrating beds to shadows crossing through their bedrooms to multiple voices whispered in tandem at night. It was one thing after another. Andrea was concerned knowing what happened to their mother was not a nightmare. This was something else, something wicked. She didn't want to distress her any further, but these confessions could not be ignored or dismissed. She could not keep any more secrets. Time was fast approaching to have a serious conversation about what was occurring in their home again. The daughters soon had a talk with their mother about all the other ghosts that were plaguing their house. All of them admitted to having their toys and trinkets moved around when they weren't there, or hearing loud and thumping footsteps at strange hours. But more than anything, the house was always cold, and it always had a rancid smell whenever the spirits decided to make themselves known. That was a constant factor. They all admitted that they felt that they were always being watched, no matter what room they went in. Additionally, the fridge continued to open on its own, splattering and soiling food, and even the phone was occasionally off the hook, as if it were just used. Despite all the creepy noises, voices, and happenings, the daughters were completely against selling the house, shocking Carolyn, who desperately wanted to move away. The spirits would continue to scare the daughters too. Cindy was the next one with the scary story, as she was alone playing with her toys one day. As the closet door opened, Cindy assumed that it was someone coming to fetch her for supper. Preoccupied, she did not look up immediately. A companion remained quiet. After a moment of silence, a quick glance upward instantly paralyzed Cindy. Frozen in place, the child was in shock. Directly before her eyes, an entity of substance slowly approached, floating above the surface of a bedroom floor. Horrified, an 8-year-old could not move, could not breathe the putrid air. Steam escaped her lips, the result of a sudden rise in heart rate, coupled with the sudden drop in temperature. Appearing as some form of a solid mist, Cindy identified the apparition as a woman by her garb. She had no features, only a grayish oval mass cocked hard to one side. She drifted across the room, arms outstretched, extended toward the terrified child. Speaking sweetly, tenderly, and with a solicitous voice Cindy could clearly hear in her head, but not actually inside the room. She was petrified, in the bubble, unable to burst free of it. "Come here, little girl. Come to me." Time was suspended. It ceased to exist, if it ever did. The object of desire was mortified. Odor accompanying this spirit was atrocious, as grotesque as the approaching image itself. A matter of seconds felt like the hours trapped with something dead. As it drew closer, she could see stark details of the figure. A white handkerchief dangling from beneath the ruffled edges of a shirt sleeve. The gray flannel blouse with pockets cinched tightly at the waist by a flowery apron covering a full-length skirt. No feet. It positioned itself directly in front of her, then began leaning in towards her. Closer and closer she came. The air pressure was stifling, pushing on from every direction. Anticipating the contact, Cynthia begged God for release from an imposed captivity. Granted. She bolted from the bedroom, running through Andrea's room, then down the staircase. It was the exact same spirit that attacked Carolyn once Cindy began to tell her all the details, especially about the appearance. That same evil entity was tormenting everyone, one incident after another. One week when Roger was finally home, he had his own brief situation when he woke up one morning and the entire bed had been moved, in their sleep. He didn't feel it at all, but he was upset about it nonetheless. Carolyn had no reaction. She'd experienced much worse than a bed moving. Roger went down to make a coffee, and as he was doing so, he felt a gentle hand brush across his shoulders and down his back. At first he thought it was Carolyn, but as he turned around, not a soul was to be seen. He was beginning to have his suspicions now. The strange paranoia was settling in. Another horrifying story from Cindy would introduce Roger to what they commonly saw in the recent days. It was just a regular night when Cindy saw Christine in a whole new image. Carolyn listened intently as a frantic child described what she witnessed. Chrissy was no longer. Her face twisted and distorted, her features gnarled and mangled. Cindy said it looked like snakes slithering underneath her skin, like something had crawled inside her and was trying to escape. It was not her sister's face at all. Cindy was terrified by what she saw, what she heard. Growling, moaning, pain. As two hollow, vacant orbs peered in her direction, she covered her head, then prayed, begging God to make it go away. And it did. She cried herself to sleep, too afraid to lower the blanket, to look at the bed beside her own, too terrified to check on her sister's condition. Instead, she crept as deeply beneath the blanket as she could, making certain nothing of her was exposed beyond its border, an act of self-preservation. There she fell asleep. When she awoke, Cindy saw the edges of their blankets were singed, scorched all around, burnt offerings. She could see a lump in Christine's bed, but did not peek beneath the torched blanket. Carolyn couldn't react the way she probably wanted to, cope through the dread and torment and ramping paranoia. There was no escape for the entire family. They were stuck with spirits that clearly wanted them out, but they had no other home to go to. Soon after, Carolyn would occasionally lose track of time. Hours gone in a flash. She realized it one day, and as an ordinary time of a regular day, if one would call it regular now. As hours passed at the sink, she'd stare out the back window and lose track of time. An afternoon gone as if it were an instant, reliving moments she longed to forget while knowing she never would. Time lost lingered with an evil spirit which was haunting her in absentia. Or was it actually gone? Carolyn continued to sense an overwhelming presence, and yet nothing had manifested in form. No one had issued any threats. Both the oppression and obsession demonic stage had settled in. She was no longer a threat, nor was her family or her husband. The spirits were in control. Carolyn knew it to be true. Other spirits would take form in other unique ways in the shape of what's called an orb, an essence of a spirit that takes form in a ball of light. Lorraine Warren would later identify this and let the parents know. But before this, Carolyn and her daughters were absolutely clueless and curious. During Christmas time, the family would have a sudden fright when Carolyn had oddly collapsed in front of all of them as they were unwrapping their gifts. She hit the ground. The hit to the ground was so hard that it was a miracle that she hadn't broken anything. This sudden collapse to the floor wasn't the only time it occurred, and it was obvious she was not the one controlling her body. Then another night came when another terrifying vision of witch-like spirits invaded their bedroom. A group of figures stood around their bed, holding smokeless torches and watching them. They began an incantation, one that had a steady rhythm and drum beats, as they spoke odd and ominous lines of threats. Carolyn was able to write them down later, and it went as such. Beseech thee, leave. Afore ye go, beware the flame, the fiery glow. Was mistress once afore ye came, and mistress here will be again. Will drive ye out with fiery broom, will drive ye mad with death and gloom. Was mistress once afore ye came, and mistress here will be again. Will drive ye mad with death and gloom, will drive ye into Satan's tomb. Thus has been spoken, thus has been read. Take leave of this place, or ye too will be dead. As the spirits were chanting this incantation, Carolyn noticed the same figure that had been haunting all of them, not just her, but giving her daughters their terrifying nightmares. The same woman whose neck was snapped to one side, no feet and no hands. Her eyes were completely black, like empty sockets, and her nose was rotting off, similar to other pieces of her skin that were decayed and dangling. The evil spirit lingered over Carolyn for a while, but after the incantation was done, she hovered over Roger and gave him a slight kiss. It wanted Carolyn to watch her husband be infected now. Carolyn's body was paralyzed. She couldn't move. But she began to think of prayers and said them in her mind, calling out to God for his protection in this dire hour. Thankfully, her prayers were answered, and the apparitions vanished, leaving the couple in their bed and with Carolyn's mind poisoned more than before. She had to calm herself somehow, in any way. She went into the parlor, where the clock had once again stopped at 5:15 a.m. Roger was angry when he approached her, but Carolyn had directed him to the bathroom mirror, where he saw that he was scratched really badly on his back. The awful demonic spirit had attacked him too. He had no words at the moment. He was absolutely terrified. Roger would face more difficulties as the house was nearly caught on fire multiple occasions. One where Andrea was home alone and where she had caught the scent of smoke. But it came from the cellar, the place where everyone avoided and felt fear. Everyone knew the sign as the spirits trying to force them out. Quite literally. Some people said it was a miracle that the house wasn't destroyed, but the parents would think otherwise. Excuse me. Despite the scares of the fires, Carolyn would continue to sit way too close to the regular fire, constantly burning at all times. She was never warm, never comfortable. Her daughters had noticed this over time, but hadn't said anything about it. This would continue throughout the duration of the haunting. Not only this, but her fainting episodes would increase, and at random times. Her weak and possessed body had another soul living in it, a demonic entity that wanted full control, but still couldn't have it. During her terrible times in the house, Carolyn soon came across a newly found friend named Fran, who seemed to be a light in a dreary dark time. One day, as Carolyn took her daughters to Fran's house, Andrea was playing a piano when the sheet music turned on its own. Fran added that, yes, she had a ghost too. It was a crazy coincidence. Either way, with such a lightened mood, Fran and Carolyn became close friends, and where Carolyn was finally getting out of the house into the fresh air, away from the cursed abode. Although Carolyn had found some comfort, the haunting still never ceased. Roger was increasingly aware of the strange happenings. He, along with his family, heard 3 extremely loud knocks on the front door, startling everyone. But Carolyn knew that if they opened the door, no one would be there. And she was right. The knocking against the main door would happen on 3 different occasions, marking that, for some, it was the mocking of the Trinity, as Mrs. Warren would later explain. However, as previously mentioned, not all the spirits had evil intentions. During one terrible storm, Cindy saw that the separate shed had a few boards suddenly loosened by the gusts of wind, and where the horses were in a panic. As she rushed to the fixed board, she wasn't able to hold it still, until someone, invisible, came to help and kept the board steady. Stunned, she was able to fix the problem, but not without an unseen helping hand. It was absolutely bizarre. It was during this time that Carolyn was searching for the true identity of Bathsheba Sherman, the supposed haunted witch that continued to plague her mind. It was the name that burned into her memory, the spirit that she wanted out. And if this was the same spirit that sent devilish visions to them all, it was Cindy's turn to witness a terrible vision. She and her sister Christine were asleep one night when Cindy heard a growling, a low and evil guttural sound. Somehow she found that it came from her sister, and where Christine's face was transforming into something awful. Paralyzed by the shock of it, she was rendered motionless by this gruesome image. Breathless, unable to intervene, Cindy watched in abject terror as her sister transformed. What movements appeared beneath the girl's supple skin became even more pronounced. It looked like fingertips protruding, trapped inside, attempting to escape by rupturing the surface. Cindy would later describe it like the snakes slithering inside of a pit. Contorting her face, inflicting pain, Cindy remained frozen in place. It got worse. Christine's mouth quickly became gnarled and mangled. The tender skin of her lips seemed to disappear as if being sucked inside her body, and then her features began moving, scrambling, and shifting out of place. A pitiful cry for help oozed from strained, pained vocal cords. Cynthia's heart was pounding. She could feel the rapid pulse throbbing in her temples, hear it rushing through her ears as tremors passed through her body. Whatever was gouging at the skin beneath the surface of Christine's face was attempting to puncture it from within, tearing through it like a creature caged, seeking release, escape. Cynthia would hide beneath her blankets, waiting and praying, and where her desperate pleas for it to stop was answered. No more distorted faces, no more growling. The intense vision was over. After this incident, another event happened where Christine was found in a very odd and also very dangerous place, locked inside of a large chest, where Carolyn's friend Kathy had found her. Christine claimed that Carolyn had come into the room, demanding that Christine needed to sleep in the box. Terrifying enough with its doppelganger effect, Christine clambered into the chest, probably out of fear, and where the box was locked. She was lucky that it wasn't too long before Kathy had found her. Throughout the year, large groups of animals began to appear across their land, more than usual, and where numerous crows would gather near and around Carolyn's garden. They didn't do anything, but it was strange enough to have enough of them around and in such big numbers. Some of the daughters would watch them occasionally, for the fun of it. And of course, during hauntings, many of the daughters' personal items and trinkets would disappear at times, only to reappear hours or days later. It was during this time, too, that Carolyn was still looking for answers for who the witch was, and although the name of Bathsheba came up quite a lot, Carolyn wasn't settled that it was her. Bathsheba was labeled as a witch and devil worshipper when a child had died in her care, and many people didn't think of her as anything good. However, these ideas and accusations seemed like rumors and guesses for Carolyn, and she kept to that, as well as her daughters. However, when Lorraine Warren came to investigate, she was positive that it was Bathsheba, who killed an infant purposely and directly in Carolyn and Roger's bedroom. Not only this, but the lingering spirit remained in the cellar, explaining the horrible smells and the constant feeling of dread whenever someone walked near it. So, what is the truth of this? I guess we'll never truly know who exactly the spirit was, since the names were tossed between Abigail and Bathsheba, so let me know. The next apparition to appear was again at Christine, and although it was the same malevolent spirit that appeared menacingly at Carolyn, this time it felt almost comforting for Christine, like a watchful entity. Even so, the spirit was terrible to look at, full of horror and terror. She awoke as Carolyn shook her awake and her sisters joined them. Another incident to pile onto the countless others, and yet the attacks against the daughters would not stop. During one night, the bed of Cynthia shook so violently and so frantically that she thought that she would be tipped and thrown over. She begged for it to stop and prayed to God for his protection against the malicious evil. The same prayers of reaching out to God and Jesus for protection needed to be repeated for all the daughters, and they all seemed to work for the present time, during the dire moments when they were attacked again and again, mercilessly. Of course, as previously mentioned, not all spirits were the bad type. There were a few instances where the straw broom began sweeping up the rooms, all on its own, like a pair of phantom hands were busy at work. That, at least in my opinion, would be the best kind of spirit to have. Carolyn later began to think that with all the lingering spirits in the house, would it be possible that some of them were part of the Arnold family in general? Looking back to her research, many of the recorded deaths were from the Arnold family, including Bathsheba, who wasn't blood-related Arnold, but still part of the family. More pieces to put together. Strange enough, from all the spirits, Andrea began to hear the distant notes of a horn, faint and far away, but as time went by, it seemed as if the horn only sounded in or near her room, sorry, lost my place here. And she began to think that it meant to be a call to arms, a message to be wary of the continuing haunting spirits and take refuge in the strength and protection of God. Still, the spirits made sounds, moved furniture, and caused havoc year after year, and still the Perron family were accustomed to the countless entities making themselves known. They, too, were part of the family, in one way or another. Not all of them would appear as full-body apparitions, but one would stick out with Cynthia's memory. The entity appeared to be about 5, maybe 6 years of age. She was short, but seemed to be a healthy, substantial girl. though she would not always appear so robust. A head full of thick dark hair cascading down instantly reminded Cindy of her own eldest sister, her round face conjuring an image Cynthia had seen before, in photographs of Andrea at this age. An uncanny resemblance, a disquieting likeness she noted immediately evoked a memory from when she was only a toddler. Time and space seemed affected by this close encounter, confusing to the mortal soul. Watching intently, the spirit moved across the bedroom, crying for Mommy over and over again before she left, walking through an unopened door into the eaves. Cindy was blown away. So many entities, so many years apart, yet they all shared the same house. Some spirits were not particularly bound to the house itself, but to the land as well. Giggling from little children could be heard occasionally when the family decided to venture into the woods. There was no harm to the laughing or any nefarious things, only it sounded odd and probably a little creepy. Over time, the so-called spirit of Carolyn changed from a positive and bright mood to many shifts of darkness that weren't part of her. The sisters noticed this from every passing day. Another situation would come around, but this time because Cynthia and one of her friends, Lori, decided to try out a seance, try to make some of the spirits leave. Choosing a spot in the house, they lit candles and began to call out to the spirits. "Close your eyes," began Cindy. Lori did as instructed. "Spirits of this house, whoever you are, come to us now." A terse, rather belligerent inflection infiltrated the youngster's voice. Cindy was confrontational. The words issued more as a command than a polite request. "Ghosts of this house, I am calling to you. Come!" In spite of ongoing silence, this terse, demanding message delivered was not well received. "If you are here, give us a sign." Nothing. "We want you to stop coming and scaring us. It is our house now." Sincere as she was candid. "I mean it. I want you all to leave us alone. You do not belong here anymore. Go away. Go be with God." Swoosh! Lights out. A mad rush of supernatural wind suddenly swept through the room, encircling the children, snuffing out a flame. Gusting ferociously, girls began screaming hysterically. Though not pitch black, strobe light from the window illuminated occupied space. Hell on earth. What was beckoned from beyond had come to call. Ouch! Lori was first to feel the hand of the law of cause and effect. Ow, my hair! Something's got a hold of my hair! Yanked flat to the floorboards, Cindy squirmed, gasping for air, gasping at her painful scalp. "Oh my God, it's got me! Lori, something's got me! Me too, I can't move!" Though still sitting upright, her head pulled back, Lori had no more mobility than Cynthia did, pinned and wriggling, fighting for freedom. Not a fair fight. "Help me! I can't move!" Out came the white flag of unconditional surrender, like they had a choice. Snagged from behind, pinned into position, Lori and Cindy were frantic. Long hair pulled so tightly, both were yelping in pain. Flailing and kicking, struggling with this invisible assailant, their unknown captor had the upper hand. No visible means of escape, hair twisted into knots, surrounded by a twister of wind. It was as if they'd been trapped in the core of a tornado. Items began flying across the room in every which way. The mattress was flipping side to side. The girls were terrified and regretted summoning the spirits. They called out to God for escape from this sudden terror, and their prayers were answered. The unseen wind and the levitating objects stopped at once, and the locked door that they were pounding on suddenly was opened by Nancy, who had barely heard their screams. Despite the terrifying encounter, Cindy would soon be a part of the Ouija board session with Nancy and her friend Katie. Once the board was set up, Katie asked who was in the house, where a low, guttural voice growled at them. From the shadows on the walls, a silhouette of a large beast appeared, continuing the growling. Noxious fumes surrounded them, more stench to fill the house again. With a sweeping gesture, the demon, in profile, turned to face the terrified trio. They dared the devil. It morphed into something a group of mortified girls could not comprehend. Throwing its ugly head back, exposing its full throat, the figure unleashed a reverberating, tremulous growl. Then it roared out its warning, casting out the mischievous mayhem makers who conjured it, releasing them from its grasp. The spell was broken. "Go away, little girls. Hit hard, now run for your lives." The girls frantically ran out of the room for their desperate escape. Ouija board experience done and over with. Curiously, whenever somebody tried to purposely reach out to the spirits, no one from outside the closed doors could hear them at all, or at least not when the devilish entities had made themselves known. Entities would particularly come out when visitors and guests stayed the night as well. But on one time, Cynthia and Andrea were viciously attacked in their sleep. The nightlight revealed the dark presence of an opaque figure hovering directly over her sister, only inches above. Cindy gasped, drawing her breath inward, where she held it in, shocked by the sight, waiting to see what would happen next. Andrea was motionless, lying on her side, a quilt up over her head. The black vaporous apparition was free-floating, lifting up, then skimming down again, almost touching the child through the surface of the quilt. Contact. It resembled a storm cloud, the elusive form rising, then falling. As the child beneath the blanket remained perfectly still, it breathed deeply in and out, hanging over her as if it were breathing for her, in unison with her. From its position over the body in bed, the entity swept down, leaping off of Andrea with one grand swoosh. It raced towards Cindy from across the room. Passing just above her head, she screamed as it wrapped itself around her ankles and dragged her off the pallet where she lay. Jerking her body so hard, her head struck the floor. It pulled her as she wailed for help, begging it to stop. It didn't matter who might be awakened by the commotion. The more the better. This was a crisis. A hysterical girl held captive, pleading for her life. Sweet little Cindy latched onto the banister at the top of the stairs, just as her torso was being hauled past it. With all the might she could muster, hooking the hard wood post with the crook of her elbows, she clung on and screamed at the top of her lungs. It felt as if a monster was ripping her legs off her body, dismembering her. Cindy implored God to intervene. It stopped. Release. Gasping for breath, the wounded kid hoisted her trembling body back up the stairs. Nightmares were a reality now, and they kept happening. Fear stacked on more fear, never ending. Out of all the daughters, April was the youngest, and seemed to always have a distrust on the spirits in the house. But she had a very strong connection to one that she met within the first few days of moving in. As April was playing with her toys and dolls, building communities and friends, she was visited by an apparition of a young boy, appearing before her in her favorite spot of the chimney closet, a space where she could be alone, or almost alone. The boy wore a pair of handmade trousers, about 3 inches too short. A pair of loosely bound brown socks sagged at his ankles inside a ragged pair of shoes. One of the shoes had a distinct hole worn into the side, too small to contain his tiny foot. The shirt was gray flannel with a strip of cloth running down the center of the front pockets on both sides. His clothing was shabby, but he appeared to be clean. He had a full head of very blonde hair, so blonde it seemed almost white. His eyes were the most haunting aspect of this tortured soul. Pale green, watery, filled with pain, and inexplicable sadness, enough to break a stranger's heart. When he looked up at the child, she acknowledged his presence, his existence, with a smile. The boy crawled out into the closet then, as he sat down on the floor a few feet away from her, a safe distance from which to observe one another. It was later found out around the early 2000s that his name was Oliver Richardson. He always felt welcomed and comfortable when April was around and would play with her. Perhaps with all the lost and dark days that he had, he only wanted to have fun, as a living child should throughout their young years. Another friendly, or almost too friendly, spirit resided in the dreaded cellar, where the family tried to ignore to go down into. However, whenever Roger went down there, he became more of a believer. The rarity was when he'd go down the hatch and was not approached. He'd go down the hatch and was not approached below ground. He insists it was Mrs. Arnold, not Bathsheba, describing her touch as gentle and even seductive. It was no secret to anyone. Whoever she was, she liked the man. Nor did she attempt to hide this time-warped attachment, not even in front of his wife, in their own bed. Roger was the only one who wasn't reluctant to go down into the cellar. He knew she would not hurt him. She posed no threat to him. It was Carolyn who was taking the brunt of the abuse. Once the man of the family began to acknowledge an underground presence in the house, after he'd been touched several times and could deny it no longer, he made friends with her. Roger was the only one who was semi-comfortable with the cellar. Sometimes the daughters would even bring a pair of scissors with them for defense, and when Lorraine Warren had heard of this, she told them, "You can't really kill what's already dead." In short, the spirit of what most called Bathsheba hated Carolyn, coveted the children, and lusted after Roger. Of course, the house was not was not only the place that was haunted, but their entire land as well. Nancy recalls that she could sense others with her when she went into the forest or up to the river to fish. One time, she even recalls seeing an entire family for a brief moment. This was during one of her many trips to the old cellar hole, nestled deep into the forest, and where she and Cindy would sometimes go for comfort and peace. Additionally, April would see spirit children darting between the trees or picking up stones from the riverbed. More spiritual fun for the unfortunate kids of an older day. Despite the gentle touches of Bathsheba towards Roger, he began to grow weary of the evil entity. The kids remembered one time that they saw Roger turn instantly angry as he saw the cellar door open and where the familiar stench of death emanated from within. With fury, he yelled out, "Get the hell out of my house, you witch!" And then he stormed towards the door. He could hear the footsteps of what was presumably Bathsheba descending the stairs. No one was surprised. Over time, the family fell into hardship financially, forcing to sell off multiple personal items, and with Carolyn opening her personal shop in the barn on the weekends. They also had to sell off part of their land just so they could stay in the house and on the property. The family began to claim it as Bathsheba's curse. No matter what they did, no matter what they said, the curse of this residual haunting was there for good. It was eating away at the once happy family. The sisters saw their father's mood switch from jovial when he was outside the house to a tempered, angry man who blamed Carolyn for almost everything when he was inside the house. Their marriage was crumbling, and the bonds between father and daughters were fading. Help was desperately needed, and help finally came. When Ed and Lorraine Warren came to their house, Carolyn and Roger already knew about them in their ghost hunting fame. Roger didn't want anything to do with them, and when the Warrens came for their first visit, Roger was absent while Carolyn introduced them to her daughters. Later that night, as the Warrens were being led throughout the house, Lorraine firmly told Carolyn that no one should be sleeping in the main bedroom, exactly where Carolyn and Roger had been sleeping for years. The same room where Carolyn had been possessed, and the room where she saw the witch-like scene with the torches and eerie incantation. Additionally, Lorraine wouldn't enter into other separate rooms because of odd sensations, mostly of dark origins. The Warrens warned them that they were all in danger, especially their children, and that they would come back. Despite Roger not wanting the Warrens there, he eventually allowed them in, and where Lorraine explained that negativity and fighting only drew in the darker spirits, encouraging them more into the home to make it their place rather than the family's. Later that day, Ed and Lorraine sat down with the girls and talked about the spirits, and where the spirits began to share their and where the sisters began to share their encounters and how the spirits talked to them, but through their minds, as if the entities' voices were telepathic. And of course, everyone talked about the stench of death and the coldness and the activity at night. Once the Warrens listened intently to the first session, both Ed and Lorraine agreed that Cindy was somehow a target for spirits. They wanted her to cross over, but it was dangerous already. After a serious chat, Lorraine took Ed aside, saying that she and Ed should probably identify and cleanse the house of the dark spirits, especially the one demonic entity that had latched onto the home and its residents. The second visit of the Warrens got the daughters talking again, where the sisters all agreed that the spirits shared the home with them and were occasionally mischievous, where Lorraine smirked and called these entities poltergeists. She told the kids that when they would ever come into trouble with the dark spirit again, for them to say a short phrase: "In the name of Jesus Christ, go back to where you came from and leave us in peace." They all repeated the phrase confidently. Realizing the terrible threat of the demonic, the Warrens suggested that they should perform a seance in the house, including a priest and a medium as well. Carolyn was for it, but she knew Roger wouldn't like the idea. However, Lorraine figured that Carolyn was deep into the oppression stage and very near to the possession stage of the demonic takeover. Setting up the seance was difficult because of Roger's absolute opposition to it, but a group of people came in eventually, including the priest and a shaman and a couple others for help. Lorraine told Carolyn the brief explanation of the demon's presence. "Someone invited a demon into your house. It might have happened many years ago before you arrived here, or it might have come in because of mischievous children playing with fire, disguised as a game, or it could have been Bathsheba Sherman, bartering your soul, but make no mistake, someone invited this demon just as surely as you invited us in many months ago." The medium began to set up candles and lighting them up from handmade matches. The seance had finally begun. The daughters ran upstairs to avoid the whole thing. Lorraine began to call out to the spirits, where they answered by moving and shifting the table before them. Just then, the possessed entity inside Carolyn made itself known. Carolyn's body recoiled, her head lifted, and she began mumbling a series of incoherent words, garbled chatter. Mary asked who was there with them. Foreign sounds began emanating from the woman. Everyone realized that it was not Carolyn's voice they were hearing. A brief collective gasp heard beneath the strange language that she was speaking. Her hands pulled free from the grasp of those on either side. Her fingers curled, nails impaling the palms of her hands. Excruciating pain appeared on Carolyn's face, and she began to moan like a wounded soldier. Her eyes sprung wide open. They were not her eyes. Suddenly, both of her legs drew up to her chin, as if her body was forming a fireball. A low-pitched guttural utterance emerged from within her being as her quaking body trembled in place. It sounded like a wild animal, warning off an intruder, preparing to attack. The shrill screams came so suddenly that no one was prepared. It rang through the rafters, almost impossible for the human body to produce. Her tiny voice had transformed into that of a creature, something angry and evil, something wicked. Carolyn's chair lifted from the floor and flew straight back, traveling at light speed into the parlor. She hit the floor with such force everyone present could hear the air rushing from her lungs. Someone screamed. Roger leapt toward his wife as Lorraine stood. Mary collapsed, head striking the table. Ed tried pulling Roger back. He whipped around and punched Ed directly in the face, dropping him to the floor. All hell had broke loose. Shutters began snapping and clicking like latches on angry doors. A loud crashing sound from the cellar came at the very last moment of the situation, but no one had paid any attention to it. Roger was furious and demanded them all to leave, but his daughters had seen everything to add to it. After the seance, the farmhouse became inordinately active for several months. During this period, Cynthia began to speak with the spirits as they manifested, instructing them to do her bidding. If she wanted to be left all alone, she told them so, and they complied. If she wanted to observe something, they would linger, accommodating her wishes. Suddenly, they became cooperative. These acknowledgments made by a child altered the dynamics in the house to the good. Everyone followed her lead. It was an entirely new level of mutual acceptance and respect. Apparently, that door between dimensions cracked open, wider than anyone had ever anticipated, and it stayed that way. That fateful seance would forever change the incidents of the house. And strange enough, Carolyn received more strength in the weeks after and began to build her own sense of confidence, while Roger became more separated from his wife and family. Carolyn thought perhaps what entered and possessed her body wasn't particularly Bathsheba, or perhaps not even Mrs. Arnold, but rather a demonic force that made its way through an open portal, possibly made either by the Ouija board session from the girls or from the seance itself. However, once winter approached again, Carolyn fell back into rapid sickness. In a sudden way, Carolyn was suffocating and was rushed to the hospital. The daughters were terrified, and Roger was angry and dealt with it in his own way. But it was a proper scare, a real scare that day, where everyone was devastated. Carolyn eventually had enough. Though she had been released from her personal possession during the seance, the spirits remained in the house, and who knows if more spirits came either during that time or from that Ouija board session. With so many experiences, the family ultimately had the desperate chance to leave the house in 1980. Now, I realize that the story, at least on my part, had a sudden and kind of abrupt ending, but since I had limited time to kind of rush through reading through 3 books of House of Darkness, House of Light, I thought I'd cover the scary, most important events during the Perron family haunting. All of them had mixed emotions during their moving out process, ranging from Roger being silent and wandering the woods to Nancy hoping the spirits would intervene and have them all stay. Either way, the family packed up, and in June of 1980, a decade of spiritual happenings and hauntings stopped, at least for them. Before moving to Georgia, and on the last days of the dreaded house in Harrisville, the very first spirit, of which was called Manny by everyone, stood by and seemingly just watched them. More residents out the door again. Additionally, Roger visited the cellar on the last day, claiming he was checking on any extra equipment, but he was really there for the too friendly spirit, the same one who touched him on his back and neck so many times. And she was there too at the last moment, where Roger says she came from behind and hugged him. On the flip side, April hoped to say goodbye to her friend Oliver, but no matter how many times she asked and coaxed him, or the essence of him, he would never show in the last week, until of course on the very last day, as they were all doing one last check, the chimney closet door opened on its own. April knew it was Oliver, and said of a goodbye to him, knowing that she would always love Oliver for who he was. Finally, Andrea remembers as some of them were pulling away, she looked back to see an apparition of a woman standing behind Nancy in the house. She didn't seem dark or evil, perhaps just another spirit watching yet another family leave. It was the last one from Harrisville house that she saw. Carolyn would not listen. She was putting that house far behind her, physically and mentally, until she was finally healed. Despite the family moving out of the Rhode Island abode, they all had a difficult time adjusting to the new environments. The daughters were all growing up, moving to different cities and spreading out. Eventually, Carolyn and Roger divorced, surprisingly, as it wasn't during their time of the haunting, but when they were out of it. The sisters agreed that they couldn't forget all the things Roger did to Carolyn, mostly emotional and also being so absent for most of the haunting. Ever since moving out of the house, they all remember it well, far into their lives, a permanent mark that would forever shape who they were. There is no darkness without the light, no light without the darkness, both relying upon one another to exist. Each concept is elemental to a process of enlightenment a family endured, yet survived it, moving on in life after the facts of the case were revealed as lesson learned, taking hold in consciousness. Obviously, as time passed, the Perron family haunting became a massive story once the movie The Conjuring was released, and where the production crew and director had all read the books by Andrea Perron, House of Darkness, House of Light. It was finally time to tell the decade-long story of spirits of darkness and light. The daughters will still claim that although there were definitely mischievous and malevolent entities in the house, there were plenty of good and almost angelic spirits as well, watching and protecting them. The haunted house in Harrisville is a hotspot for all paranormal investigators and fans of the supernatural, and for many good reasons. Many people who visit the house still claim that spirits are there, lingering within the walls and behind closed and sometimes open doors. And that is the the episode of the story, I should say, of The Conjuring, of the Perron family haunting. I do want to note, obviously, that there was a lot of other things that happened that I couldn't really include because it was going to be like a much longer episode, and it would have been just like a straight book review at that point, which I wouldn't mind doing, but that's kind of why I just chose to do with the main story. But let me know what you guys think about the Conjuring haunting and the Perron family haunting. Let me know if there's like different like stages that you guys might have interpreted differently as I did. I think the whole key element of Carolyn and Roger just not getting along, constantly having fights, all that stuff definitely brings in bad energy. Some people definitely believe that. Like my wife and I will notice things like auras, things like that. Not physically, but once somebody leaves like our place, it'll be something weird, that's in the air, so to speak. It's kind of difficult to explain, but I think some of the spirits from the Harrisville house did that same thing. It attracted all these darker spirits and would throw things across the room and things like that. Also, additionally, I think that whatever spirit's in the cellar is still there. Carolyn, yes, she was cured, I guess, quote-unquote, cured from her possession during that seance, and so she was no longer possessed past that point, but there wasn't really any, exorcism of the actual house. So I think the reason why people return to that house, paranormal investigators and whatnot, they keep coming back to that house because they are still there. I don't think there's really been a true huge exorcism of the actual house, so it'd be interesting to go there. It's I've been wanting to cover this story actually for the longest time, so hopefully you guys enjoyed the whole story, and it was actually one of the main reasons why I really wanted to start the show in the first place. And I know that my camera's kind of glitching out. It's kind of so I think it's telling me now that it's about time to end it. So yeah, just let me know your guys' thoughts on this whole haunting story. As I said, plenty of other details that I didn't really include, But if you do want to read more about it, obviously, as I've mentioned plenty of times throughout this episode, House of Darkness, House of Light. It is a trilogy of books by Andrea Perron, obviously with all of her experiences, and I'm very happy that I was able to read all three of them and really get the whole grasp of what The Conjuring was all about. As you can see, I don't know if you guys can see behind me, I got this the Conjuring little quote unquote painting that I did just because I love the film so much. I don't have a shirt, unfortunately, for you guys, but yeah, I'm just really glad I could cover this case. It's a monumental and huge paranormal case that pretty much everybody knows. Yeah, let me know, as always, let me know in the comments how well I did this. What are your thoughts? Was any of this real? Were the visions of Carolyn, were they I wouldn't say like were they real, but like were they visions? Did she actually see it as, you know, like past spirits? But if it was only like a one-time thing, was it really just a malevolent spirit plaguing her with nightmares? As some of the stages of demonic possession, some of that either oppression or obsession stage, I'm pretty sure it's the oppression stage, where the spirit can give you like really vivid nightmares. So maybe it was like that one demonic entity that was really latched onto her is giving her constant nightmares of all these things, and she's doing all this research about the property and about Bathsheba and witchcraft and all that stuff. And I think personally that whole side of Carolyn receiving visions is because of that one demonic entity that was latched onto her and trying to possess her body until obviously the seance came. Of course, that's just me, because after the seance she stopped having the visions. She, you know, didn't have any of the nightmares. Obviously the spirits were still there and still trying to get at her, but obviously once they moved, she got a little better. So I just kind of wanted to make a point about that. Just a cool little theory that I have, I suppose. And then obviously with the kids experiencing all these movements, moving the toys and seeing Manny, which having a friendly ghost it would be really cool, I think. Just in general, to have a friendly ghost like Manny just kind of like standing there watching, or the ghost that was like sweeping up their kitchen. It's kind of insane, where it's like, yeah, a lot of times people think of having a residual haunting like as a bad thing, but like, yeah, there was good spirits in that house. and it's great to hear that there were good spirits on that land. So it makes me personally want to visit the Conjuring house, because knowing that there are good spirits out there too, and maybe willing to communicate, it really brings the fear a little bit less, but also at the same time it's The Conjuring, so everybody's afraid of it. So yeah, last comments. I think just like the case of The Conjuring, the Perron family haunting, I think would be a lot scarier just to like be there and witness than the actual movie. Movie is great, by the way. It is like my favorite paranormal movie. It's my favorite horror movie of all time. I absolutely love The Conjuring. They did a really great job. I remember, I think it was Andrea went with Lorraine Warren to like a private showing, the first showings of The Conjuring, and I guess they both like were satisfied with what it was, because it kind of like it gripped that fear, you know, that something was there constantly watching them. So I guess that they didn't mind The Conjuring, which is actually really cool to hear. So so I guess with that, yeah, go and watch The Conjuring, or better yet, buy the trilogy of House of Darkness, House of Light after you watch the movie, and then just kind of like see what's similar, what's different, things like that. I hope you guys enjoyed my deep dive into The Conjuring haunting. I always say The Conjuring haunting. It really is like the Perron family haunting, or the Arnold Estate haunting. Obviously, the house was on the Arnold Estate from way back then, and obviously with the whole thing with Mrs. Arnold, you know, literally hanging herself in the barn. So I think like that would be like the ultimate hotspot. besides the house. And I could obviously, ramble on and on and on about this, but got a time limit, so, and I'm a little sleepy. So with all of that being said, thank you guys so much for joining me in this spooky finale episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it for October. I really, really enjoyed it. It is spooky time. It's amazing. It's awesome. Weather's really, really great. It's October. Everybody's excited. So hope you guys enjoyed it. And I will see you guys in the next episode. So stay spooky.